Hello then, welcome to this downfield idealistic crusade. I'm the motion picture analyst, and continuing in my series of James Bond commentaries, this will be a commentary on the fourth James Bond film of the official series, which is, of course, 1965's Thunderball. And again, this will follow in the same style as I've done in my previous commentaries. So this is a very loose, informal commentary. Imagine it, as Sir Roger Moore always used to say, as a one-sided conversation where I go through the film and my various bits of trivia knowledge about the production history, and also various readings of character and different scenes to sort of give you an idea of what goes through my head when I rewatch the film. And you'll hear my brain going in about 10,000 different directions. So this is in no means a proper history of the film in all its aspects, because that would take far longer than the 2 hours, 10 minutes that this commentary will run. So again, do keep in mind it's just a very loose, informal thing, and I'll mention things that come to mind, and again, talk a bit about the production and my own readings on the film, which has kind of become more and more divisive as time goes by within the fan community. A lot of people have different opinions on most Bond films, but Thunderball is one that I think has become, quite divisive. But with the passage of time, most people are not as aware of its impact in 1965, which was, practically earth-shaking at the height and peak of what had become Bond mania and the spy craze that was really spawned by the phenomenal success of Goldfinger in 1964. So, again, this is a very loose, informal commentary, and do keep in mind it is not professionally recorded, so I will just do my best to keep up with the film and whatever comes to mind. So go ahead and queue up whichever version of the film you have. Go ahead and get it to the 0 minute, 0 second mark. And again, this is just a rough sync, so different versions have different opening and closing logos, so it won't probably match up exactly to the version you have. But again, this is not meant to be a professionally recorded commentary track anyway. Also, do take the time, if you're looking at a modern version of the film, definitely go in and select whichever soundtrack preference you have. Thunderball has a particular and a sound history, the one that has not particularly been very well researched. There are two distinct different audio mixes floating around out there with different variations, and I'll try to mention some of those as they come up. It is mentioned in some of the extras that were produced for the Laserdisc and DVDs that highlight some of those differences, but not all of them. And depending on which version of the film you've got, MGM did a home video stereo remix in 1995 for the Laserdisc box set, and used as their source this alternative audio track, and that's where most people started hearing all the differences for the first time. So if you select any version in stereo or 5.1, it's usually one version, and then they have an alternate mono-labeled track that has, it's a completely different audio mix with other differences and line variations and such. So do keep that in mind, depending on which version of the film you have and which track you're listening to. There's going to be some differences that I'll try to highlight as we come to them throughout the film. So anyway, go ahead and sync your copies at the very start, and we're just going to do a rough count in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and press play now. So now we're into the first proper gun barrel in scope. This is Connery doing the gun barrel walk for the first time, replacing the Bob Simmons gun barrel shot for Dr. No. Thunderball being the epic Bond film to end Bond films. It was the first film shot in Panavision, which is a great distinction because Panavision is, of course, without the distortion problems caused by CinemaScope and all the early scope films. Now, opening on the coffin there, of course, as the initials JB, as is remarked on in just a moment, and that is one of Harry Saltzman's favorite ideas of starting a film with James Bond being dead, which is why you have that pop up in For Much With Love and later You Only Live Twice. So it's a nice little attention grabber there. The first thing you see is a coffin that presumably is the body of James Bond, which of course is revealed to be Colonel Beauvoir, which of course has many different names in terms of how you spell it and how Connery pronounces it on screen. But anyway, here we see his widow for the first time, which of course is revealed to be the agent himself. And in a nice touch of fine living and Bond's knowledge of fine living, it is the giveaway here of the widow opening the door by herself, which apparently is a giant no-no in customs, that you can see Bond is disquieted by this. And so this sets up the pre-title sequence, which is very obviously designed to follow in the success of the fantastic Goldfinger opening title, which leads to the fight that is very much designed to be an improvement to bigger staging of that famous fight scene. Here's one of the fun production gaffes. You see the reflection of the camera lighting and the door there for a second as it's opened. So Thunderball, of course, marks the return of Terrence Young to the director's chair, and I like to think you can feel that from the very opening of the film. It's much more somber than anything in Goldfinger, and throughout the film you could feel that Bond is once again back in mortal danger. There is more of an assurance, a confidence, a different feeling, a texture that is just not there in Goldfinger. Now, of course, here you see the widow, and she's in shadow because, of course, it's now Bob Simmons in drag, which, once you know more about the production, it's quite humorous seeing Bob Simmons made up, especially once the hat comes off here in a minute. And this is a fantastically staged fight that, again, you can tell that the idea was to top what had been done in Goldfinger. And just that slight element of the ludicrous of Bond fighting a Spectre agent in drag is just it's a right particular tone. And of course Peter Hunt speeding up the chair there as just one of his signature moves of giving it just that extra little bit there. There's also a little jump cut there where Bob's arm goes over Connery's head. Just anything to make the film play a little bit more. And again, there right here in the opening fight, there's a brutality that's back that was not in Goldfinger. Bond gets hurt a little bit. That hitting of the poker there, of course, leads to the line about the scar later on. And here we get this great close-up of Connery really struggling because he's literally breaking the man's neck with the poker. And again, far darker in the opening 3 minutes of Thunderball than anything that had come before in Goldfinger. And the perfect grace note of the flowers, which is exactly what Bond had come to do, if you want to look at it that way. Now here's the introduction of the Bell-Textron rocket pack, which, of course, that's a process shot there of Connery having to put on the helmet because Bill Suter, the man who flew the pack, refused to fly without a helmet. And yes, this is a bit impractical. You know, how did Bond get a jetpack on there? And why would he bring a jetpack to just kill a guy in a chateau? Of course, Thunderball being a giant spectacle, this can be said to be the mark and point at which the series was starting to be swept up in its own success, you know, putting the cart before the horse. Here's a little fun bit. If you look at the DB5's trunk, it doesn't close all the way because they can't possibly close it over the giant belt. And also, of course, the jetpack itself would be, you know, white hot to the touch after that flight. We get a nice little reference back to Goldfinger with the bulletproof shield. And, of course, the jets are a great allusion to the fact that this is going to be a water film, and of course those were just fire hoses hooked underneath the DB5. Now the transition into Binder's title sequence and the fact that it's all underwater, again, it's all this continual theme of water and being underwater, and it's getting the viewer and the audience set up for the fact that a good portion of the film is going to be underwater. Of course, the title sequence features the iconic Tom Jones theme song, which, as most Bond fans by now know, is not what was originally composed, recorded, and intended for the film. Originally, the title song was called Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which was titled after one of Bond's foreign nicknames, and John Barry was very proud of it. They recorded 2 versions, one with Shirley Bassey and then the primary one with Dionne Warwick, and designed it to fit the title sequence, but the 11th hour, United Artists and everybody panicked that they needed a title song with the title of the film. And so very quickly, Barry recomposed everything, and they came up with the theme song that we know and love. And if you look very closely under critical eye, you can tell there's a great a thematic similarity to Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, because of course that's the song the whole score was written in mind with. We'd get the same returning primary key cast and crew members, and keeping that Bond team family idea alive. Ken Adam is back, so that means we have the larger-than-life sets. And, of course, this is Murray Spinder coming back to the Bond series and really establishing his iconic nude silhouettes that would become so ingrained in the public's mind and then be used essentially all the way until his last title sequence, which was for License to Kill in 1989. Of course, this was all designed around Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang originally, so that's why the intro of that song, the lyrics don't start until where the Thunderball title credit would have appeared in the titles. And you can make the argument that the actual subject of the song, some see it as about the film's villain Largo, or a song about Bond himself, so it has this nice ambiguity to it. And of course, the screenplay credit gets to the whole heart of why Thunderball was made fourth instead of first, and the legal case surrounding the publication of the novel in 1961. That also explains why Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman are not the producers under credit, but it's actually Kevin McClory, who was the person who successfully sued Fleming for the rights to the Thunderball story. And Terence Young's credit, which, again, the best thing about Thunderball was bringing Young back, who, to handle a film of such gargantuan scale, you really needed somebody who knew this series and what they were doing. Of course, originally the producers did ask Guy Hamilton to come back, but he said that he was, he's pretty much worn out after doing Goldfinger, needed to recharge the batteries, which honestly is a very honest and good answer. And I think there is something to that. I think if you do something obviously too many times, you can get burned out. This shot here of Largo being reflected in the sign always to me has been reminiscent of the opening of Under Majesty's Secret Service, when you actually see Peter Hunt reflected in the Universal Exports sign. And of course, Peter Hunt was a great friend of Terence Young's, and really in a lot of ways, I hate to use the term disciple, but you can definitely tell he was enormously influenced by Terence Young in his directing style and how he looked at the Bond films. And I think you can see a lot of Thunderball's rhythms even in Under Majesty's Secret Service. So here, of course, Largo, played by Adolfo Celli, as Spectre Agent Number 2, entering the grand Ken Adams set for the Spectre boardroom, which basically has become a complete cliche in pop culture. And of course, we'll see the unseen Blofeld returning from when we last saw him in From Russia with Love, once again played by Anthony Dawson, of course the great friend of Terence Young's, who appeared as Professor Dent in Dr. No. And again, as gargantuan and as amazing as Ken Adams' sets are, I'm always struck at the simplicity, the cleanliness of some of them. This one in particular, and I do think it definitely presages what his designs look like, even on He Only Lived Twice. There's a lot of these, the lamps, the wood tables, the angles of the ceiling, and the confines of the set are very much in his design aesthetic, particularly his innovative uses of triangular shapes, as in Dr. Strangelove and the Goldfinger Rumpus Room. Of course, here is the iconic moment when Blofeld realizes that someone doesn't understand what happens when you don't play by Spectre's rules. Of course, this was changed from Fleming's novel, because originally in the novel, the would-be the would-be ne'er-do-well of Spectre had actually interfered, shall we say, with a kidnappee of Spectre. And there's a little passage in Fleming's novel that I love, that Spectre actually refunds part of the ransom because, in their parlance, the kidnappee was returned damaged. It's a very, very dark way to look at it. And of course, the electrocution scene has become very, very iconic. And I've always loved how Largo doesn't even bat an eye, and he's just doing paperwork like it's some great board meeting. Of course, everybody's wiping off with a handkerchief because they know it could be them at any moment. And then to cap it off, the chair rises back up totally empty with just little wisps of smoke coming out. It's that nice, as everybody would put it, the tongue in the cheek, the way you undercut the tension. You give that slight bit of laughter. But again, in the three Terrence Young films, it's perfectly done with always that dark ambiance. It doesn't have that same flavor that was in Goldfinger. And it must be taken into account that Thunderball was made at a point where James Bond was, one of the biggest things in the entire world, a part of the British invasion, as it were. And Goldfinger's influence on pop culture at large was so far-reaching that, everybody went into Thunderball. There was no way the film wasn't going to be successful, but it became a challenge on how to make a great film and meet the audience demand to go bigger than what they had done before, but also now everybody else was trying to jump on the Bond wagon, as it came to be known. You had every major television network with their own spy shows. Every film studio wanted to have their own rival James Bond spy production. And this, of course, also led to many, many spoofs. So now Bond not only had competitors in all areas, but the Bond team had to compete against not just the rivals, but then the spoofs, which would culminate in things like the 1967 Casino Royale spoof film. You're also seeing already in the writing here in the scene with Moneypenny, it's doing the traditional office scene, but they're moving it around, they're putting it in different areas. So here it's a phone conversation. And we have more of the traditional office scene later on, but it's starting to be broken up because I think everybody's starting to recognize that, you do the same thing too many times in a row, it starts to get stale, so you have to break it up. And from this point forward, you will see moments where in the actual scripting that they're trying to break up the traditional, A to B to C to D plot structure that we all know and cherish for the Bond series. Now, a lot of people have always complained that Thunderball focuses too much on the underwater sections and it moves too slowly and things like that, which I can understand, but I don't really think it's the underwater aspect. I think it's really more overall that the film has a more leisurely pacing to it. And you can see it in moments like this where it's more about the nuance and the character. This is just, simply Bond sort of bungling around in shrublands, but it's drawn out for suspense, and you get all these nice little character moments. Sean is very relaxed here and takes his time, but the grace note, and one of the great moments of Bond's character in any film is the moment where he takes the time to steal the grape out of the plate as an act of defiance and just pops it in his mouth. It's little moments like this that you see throughout Thunderball that I think is so intrinsic to it being a Terrence Young film, and the notion of getting the whole family back together, the certain charm you see in Sean's eyes, the way that he plays certain scenes, and it's not just playing them, it's playing around with them, and he's never quite the same in his other films, and I think it's this particular dynamic that he and Terrence Young had set, and so with Terrence coming back, it was like, okay, now we can play around again, and I think this is one of the aspects that helped everybody to get through this being such a gigantic production with multiple units shooting worldwide, and then of course all the underwater units and things. But again, I do think you can't get away from the fact that this is the point at which the producers and everybody became more focused on spectacle. And this is sort of a departure from the first three films where, not to say that everybody had blinders on, but, for the first three films, it was like the whole production was in their own world. They became more and more successful, but they weren't earth-shattering. They could still focus. They could be creative. There was no established formula. But with Goldfinger being film number 3 and basically taking the world by storm, that set in mind for a lot of people that there was a formula that had been firmly established, and now you had to improve on that, but you had to stick with it. And Thunderball became, practically the most anticipated film in history, and everybody was waiting to cut their slice, and everybody had an opinion. So the notion of there being too many cooks in the kitchen, I do think you can start to apply that here, but it doesn't ruin the film, which is fantastic. It's amazing that it didn't, but I do think that is a key factor to keep in mind. This, of course, is the famous traction table sequence, which is terrifying in its implications, and of course, this is really dangerous. And you notice Bond passes out, and it's a great moment where we go to this hand-told shot, and then of course we cut back, and it's slightly out of focus before it pulls back in, which is a great way to show Bond's complete, he almost died, and he's totally out of it. And of course, undercut with, "I must be 6 inches taller." So again, even here in Shrublands, in this annoying hellspot Bond finds himself at, it is a real moment of tension and danger, and Bond himself almost dies, and should have died technically. It is a close call without being able to use one of Q's gadgets or having any way out. And again, you get more of a sense of danger even from a small scene like that in Thunderball than you do in the entirety of Goldfinger. And here we have the tryst with Pat Fearing, and again, the raw sensuality that I think only is in the Terrence Young films. You see right here in the moment where she technically has this sort of nude scene against the glass. It's a slight moment, but it's that perfect inherent eroticism almost, that level of sensuality that's so important and vital. Now, this scene is one nobody talks about, but this, I think, is one of the absolute key scenes of the film. The moment where Bond roasts Count Lippy almost alive, and it does it so playfully with the handle of the mop here, and turns the dial all the way up so he gets roasted inside the tanning machine. And it's like Bond and Count Lippy are playing like children. And, of course, this is in Fleming's novel, but the way it's done here, the way that John Barry scores it, and the way that Sean makes a little face and has that look in the eyes as he closes the door. And, of course, it reads Sitz Bath and Heat Treatment. Now, this scene with the mink glove was cut in the UK. Some censors objected to it being, far too steamy, as it were. And, again, it's a simple little scene, but it is very sensual. Now, here when you see Count Lippy, it's hard to tell on some of the older video transcripts, but if you look in the makeup, he is very much, he has that very sunburned appearance, which, of course, belies the fact that, he had to go get some ointment at least and through the plans of Spectre up because he got himself roasted. And again, going back to the notion of this film being sensual, here we have Major Duvall and Fiona Volpe, who is just practically exploding off the screen with just sheer sensuality. I do think that you could make the case that not only does Thunderball have the greatest assortment of beautiful actresses, but I do think it is probably, without question, I think Dr. No and From Russia with Love are contenders, but I think Thunderball is probably the sexiest of all the Bond films. And I do think that was fully intended. And of course, Fiona is so wonderfully evil that we all adore her. Now, this is a wonderful process shot, of course. You have the same actor playing both roles. And, of course, if you look at this too closely, you can tell it is a process projection shot. But it is that slight artificiality that gives it that weird, surreal quality. I've always loved the fact that they were able to keep the actor when he's on the ground and dead as his former self, to keep his eyes wide open. And the way that John Barry scores this, the weird sort of chiming effect, this is a motif that he repeats over and over. It does give this whole scene a nice undercurrent of being otherworldly. And This is an interesting improvement on Fleming's novel. Of course, in the novel, Patachi, who is his name, just is bribed, which is simple enough. But again, this being a giant spectacle, you couldn't just bribe the guy. You had to have somebody conform to be his surgically perfect double and have this over-elaborate plot to do the air hijacking. So again, I think it's another sign of the whole notion of the film being a spectacle. It had to be bigger than life, and that became an inherent part of the Bond series really from Thunderball onwards. It wasn't something they were ever able to fully get away from. It's this notion of you can't just do a simple spy story anymore. It's got to be bigger than life all the way through. And once again, to go back to the notion of this being the first Bond film in scope, it is extremely important that this was still the era of roadshow films and 70 millimeter large format, and especially it rolled out in roadshows with multi-track stereo sound. But here I think the producers made a very wise choice. There is some rumors that there were Bond films that did come out in 70 millimeter in certain runs, but Thunderball, as far as anybody can tell, did not. But they spent their money on, it was a gargantuan production, but they at least shot it in scope, which adds, again, for, no pun intended, scope and scale to it being a mammoth canvas. And if you look at the way that Ted Moore shoots this, and of course Ted Moore returns from shooting the first 3 Bond films, this film is so well shot and composed. Every shot is extremely sharp, very well lit. It looks far more expensive. It looks like a large format roadshow film, and it isn't. And it looks exceptional if you ever get the chance to see a print on a large theater screen. This is one of those films that, the larger the screen, the bigger the experience you have, the better. And it really needs to be seen on a big screen. Now, there in this sequence, you saw 2 usages of actual screen wipes. Peter Hunt was playing around with his editing style, and I think that's another thing that causes the film to feel different and makes a lot of people think that it just moves slower, and then their first thought is, oh, it's because it's all the underwater stuff and people are moving around. So, no, I think it's also because it doesn't have that same 100% charge to Peter Hunt's editing rhythms that you got in the first 3 films, which were really like you grabbed a live wire for 2 hours. It was just boom, 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 boom. Thunderball is starting to play around with that, and you have some of his jump cuts, but not as many, and you see the first and really some of the only usages of screen wipes and their actual optical wipes put in. So some people will talk about those and act like the whole film is edited that way, but if you look at it more closely, what he does is mostly use really brilliant transitions. So throughout the film, he cuts on really cute one-liners or things that move past the screen, or he goes to a certain thing that's moving and then cuts. And that really makes the scenes play. And I think this is a key moment. Bond sneaking around the hallways of shrublands, should be a very boring thing, but the darkening of the set, the way that Connery's moving around, again with his cat-like grace that everybody has always commented on, and that with John Barry's score, I think adds such a charge to this scene that is similar but different to what we've gotten before. And you have to watch the scene very carefully because it's a lot of little things that add up. Bond notices the swaying of the curtains. He hears noises. He's able to piece together that somebody's out there and obviously waiting to jump him. And he's gathering information at this point because this, of course, is where he finds Derval's body, which has been hidden very clumsily because they're caught in the act. So, again, we have Bond being his, intelligent self, being the detective character that's inherent at being an intelligence man. And there's a lot of fun little things, like the sound of the curtains being drawn back is a nice, charged up moment in the soundtrack that's a bit louder, just to, sort of jolt you awake. Same thing, sometimes the score is brought up, and here we see Count Lippe drawing on the silencer. Now, this is something you totally would miss in all the older pan and scan versions, because Lippe is on the exact edge of the frame, and that's the first thing that goes in pan and scan. So I remember the first time I got to see Thunderball actually letterboxed, this scene finally made sense. And also you see the shadow of the other guy coming up and start to go down. So that's a key thing, because Bond has obviously caught it out of the corner of his eye, but you wouldn't know that, and it draws it up. You see the knife, and then the absolute badass moment of drawing the guy through and just dumping the phone over him. But it's capped off here by the movement of knocking the fire alarm with the elbow, which is something I try to replicate to this day, can't ever pull it off, and is probably one of the most badass moments that Bond has in the entire series. And then completely nonchalant and already talking up another lovely lass. And if you notice here, Peter Hunt waits for the one-liner, waits for Sean's glance, and then cuts to the Vulcan. So it's letting some of these moments play out a little bit more. Keeps that charge there, but it's already showing that he's growing, and the whole feel of the film series is changing here. It's growing, it's cooking along. So I understand some people finding Thunderball as a slow film, but I think that's kind of unfair, because I think most people don't look at it as seriously as, say, I do. And then again, maybe it's just me talking through my hat. So, of course, that sets up the airplane hijacking, which was a contribution originally. The person to really suggest this idea of hijacking the atomic bombs in the air was Jack Whittingham, who was the screenwriter brought in to help develop the Thunderball story. And I guess just talk a little bit about that, because that could fill up an entire commentary in and of itself. But basically, Thunderball was originally devised to be a James Bond film production, because Kevin McClory got together with Ian Fleming, and they were trying to make a James Bond film, and Fleming couldn't get anyone interested. So McClory's idea was that they needed to start from scratch and make a fresh story. So his ideas were, he wanted to have a lot of it underwater, and they wrote various drafts, but it wasn't really going anywhere. They brought in Jack Whittingham, who was a known screenwriter, and he helped condense and get it into a working screenplay. And of course, after many drafts going back and forth, the project just didn't exactly go very far, and everybody started getting cold feet. And then finally, it just got shelved, and Fleming decided he would use the abandoned treatment for his next novel, which is something he had done before with Dr. No and some other things. But basically, McClory got wind of it and sued, and eventually they settled out of court, and McClory wound up with the rights to make Thunderball. And so that's why Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were so eager to make a deal. So they didn't have a rival Bond production at the height of Bond mania. So that's why they wound up doing Thunderball after Goldfinger. And the deal was McClory got to share the profits and the producer's credit, and couldn't make anything with his rights for another 10 years. And of course, right in 1975, he popped up again with his new Thunderball project, which he called Warhead. So that's a very brief explanation, but just to get that out of the way. Now, that's a brilliant edit in the middle of all of that, of the stealing of the Vulcan and the sound really kicking up and increasing in pitch and tone, and then we immediately cut back to the headquarters. So it adds this tension, because you cut immediately out of that. No wipes, it's a hard cut, and we see this dawning on everybody. And then we're going to cut right back. And the sound's going to be right back, and then we're right back. And of course, all the shots of the Vulcan as it's moving, there is some day for night going on, so there is some filtering, and it looks very different on a lot of different prints and video versions. So as with any day for night photography, it will vary some. Now we're introduced to Largo aboard the Disco Volante for the first time, the iconic hydrofoil yacht that we all wish we owned. And of course, the eye patch and double-breasted coat give that nice piratical look. And of course, Adolfo Celli was dubbed as Largo, so it's Robert Rietti doing the voice. And I've always loved the tone of voice that he gets. Again, Peter Hunt always tried to get somebody who had a similar vocal timbre, or timbre, however you say that, to match that. So it gives it a nice oomph to the revoicing. And here we get the actual crash landing of the Vulcan. I've always loved the effect shot of the underwater lights kicking on, and it's really well done, especially when you realize all this had to be composited in by hand. And the whole sequence is executed amazingly well. The only problem I have is if you look very closely as the Vulcan goes down, especially here in the underwater shot, you can tell in certain areas where it is a model just because it's so difficult to do models with water involved because it's really difficult to get the perspectives quite right. But that's just a fleeting thing. If you look at any model shot too long, you will see the seams no matter how well it's done. But again, nobody had ever done anything like this before. And of course, what I've always loved about Largo as a villain is he doesn't send henchmen to do stuff when he can go and do it himself. So Largo goes down to the Vulcan by himself and, takes charge, and he always leads his men underwater. So this is the first of the major underwater sequences, and again, I do think the editing rhythm already being established as being a bit more nuanced does help set up that we're going to have a lot of this stuff underwater. But if you look quite carefully, you will notice that Peter Hunt tries to keep things moving. He keeps things as short and concise as possible, so the stuff doesn't drag. And again, John Barry really ups the ante in his score to drive drama in what's going on. Well, this is one of the great moments where Largo cold-bloodedly cuts his air hose. And, what a way to go. It's amazing that that's a real stuntman who did have a little trouble when he did this actual shot, but was perfectly fine. And it sets up this murder sets up Largo and his vindictiveness that he's not someone to be trifled with, and, Norris Spector. And again, that whole sequence is actually quite short, and you see how Peter Hunt is keeping the rhythm going already. We're getting the lowering of the bomb sled submarine. We didn't have a scene inside. Now it's already cut to it moving away. It's actually going quite quickly. Yes, guys are having to swim around very slowly. This is the great dramatic reveal of the bombs, which they had to do a lot of. The production team had to do a lot of elbow twisting and stuff to get information out, just as they had to do on getting information about the design of Fort Knox and Goldfinger. A lot of, the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and, ask questions that couldn't be answered, things like that. And I've always loved the fact that they have the warning on them, the warning handle like eggs, which just always cracked me up. But apparently, that's literally what was on most devices of this type in real life, which is, absolutely ludicrous to think about and also strangely terrifying in some way. There you see it very clearly, handled like eggs. Now, of course, all of the underwater sleds and propulsion units were real, or actually designed, commissioned especially for the production, and really add a level of realism and audacity to it, because these were craft that people just hadn't seen before, and you can now get items like this for I guess the luxury underwater market, but still it was a particular brand of futurism that got started really on Goldfinger, but here in Thunderball it became so inherent. You had to have things that were realistic, but no one had ever seen them before, but they really do exist. It's never too far outside the realm of believability. Now here, the score kind of slows down, and we get this nice feeling of movement. So again, I understand people can think this is slow, but if you really look at it, it's still moving at a good pace, but it's a different kind of pace. But I think it is very important to look at how well this is put together, because otherwise this could go on for 45 minutes. Now, when we talk about the editing of the film, Thunderball was such a mammoth production that they really had a lot of trouble in the post period, and the Bond films had sort of started a precedent at opening on a certain date for the London premiere, and United Artists wanted everybody to stick to that. Goldfinger opened in September, and they wanted Thunderball to open in, September. Was the general idea, but Thunderball was such a vast production, far bigger than even Goldfinger, that it was just impossible to do. So Peter Hunt basically was able to convince United Artists to, postpone and allow them the time to be able to edit more properly. So they basically got till December. Now here's one of the great transitions. You notice where that bubble comes up from the submarine. It gets to about dead center of the frame, and that's where he chooses to cut, and then Stand By the Witch in the submarine. It's very brief, but gets you out of the underwater sequence, except for the shot of actually showing the sub going into the underwater hatch. But that's an example of the transitional edits that Peter Hunt uses throughout the film to keep it moving and to try and get an energy and a pace in there. But the rough cut of Thunderball was about 4 hours long from all reports. So a lot of just ridiculous cutting had to take place because Thunderball is, significantly longer than the first three Bonds, which all clocked under 2 hours. Thunderball is 2 hours, 10 minutes. And, Peter Hunt did say he did cut the final battle to about 3 or 4 minutes, and the producers insisted that he put more footage back in, so it runs more like 10 to 12. But, outside of that, it seems he had to do most of the cutting in the second act, which is really where, if you want to talk about the film slowing and stuff, it really kind of does bog down a little bit in the second act. And you can, if you really look at it very closely, I think there's a couple spots where you can tell there's some work going on. And I'll talk about one moment in particular where Peter Hunt literally switched the order of certain sequences. But I do think the first act and the third act move really, really well. So I think if anybody wants to, say the film moves slow in any place, I think they'd have to focus on the second act, where all of the really heavy cutting had to come, and most of the deleted sequences we know about were from the second act. And the fun in-joke here is Bond saying "another time, another place," which is fun because obviously Bond hates shrublands, but also it's a nod to Connery, one of Connery's first films, which was called Another Time, Another Place. So this is really the main sequence featuring the DB5. And of course, Count Lippe chasing after Bond is right out of the novel, where he tries to assassinate Bond, rather impractically, with a snub-nosed revolver at speed. But again, there's a nice notion of speed, a nice notion of danger. Bond doesn't get to use the gadgets, but we know they're there, and we're anticipating it. And so it's setting up for it. Connery has the great gleam in the eye, he's like, oh, I'm going to get this bastard. But we get the third player. We get the BSA Lightning coming up here. And with the rocket going off, Bond is surprised, the audience is surprised, and it's already up the stakes from what we've gotten before. We thought we were getting a nice little scene, as in Goldfinger, maybe with the tire slashers, but that's been jerked out. Now, Bob Simmons drove the car here, and when he dove out at the last second, it was really close. So it was one of those moments where everybody thought that, he had bit the dust, and he comes up behind everybody. This is a beautiful touch, seeing the rider throw the motorcycle off into a small lake, pull off the helmet, and reveal Fiona's long red hair. Just matter-of-factly. And now we get what we think is going to be the Moneypenny M office scene, but it's changed up, and it's even underlined by the fact that the hat rack has been moved up to the door. So that's another one of the little minor touches that, shows, all right, we know what we're doing. Let's play with it a little bit. What can we do different? So Sean goes to throw the hat and puts it on the rack. It's a lovely sound effect here, Bond's footsteps being really loud because he's the only person walking in this great hall. And M's line, well, now that we're all here, the way that Sean looks over, it's sort of the father reprimanding the unruly son. So it's a nice sort of slight against Bond. Now, this is setting up the problem. This is setting up Spectre's delivery of the tape and their demand for a ransom, because they're essentially holding the world for ransom. Again, this could move really slow. This sort of takes the place of the regular M office scene. We get a little tag of this at the end when Bond is assigned to Station C, Canada. But we do get a greater glimpse of the intelligence forces at large. We see these other operatives in slight glimpses. And another nice touch is you see some of the chairs are, occupied by female operatives. So there's a little nod, perhaps, that even in 1965, MI6 and British forces did have female operatives. So that's a nice touch. It does give a sort of expanded view of things because we're so used to seeing Bond being the only, 00, even though there's always three 00s in the 00 section at any given time. This scene also, once again, gives you that expansive usage of the scope frame. Again, Chedmore does such a fantastic job in framing this entire film because while this was a big epic film, it wasn't, say as expensive as a giant 70 millimeter roadshow film. It was far bigger in scale and budget than Goldfinger had been, but it wasn't at, what films could be. It was still modest in certain ways. So the fact that he could do this and make it look so wonderfully expensive combined with Ken Adams' sets is another reason why Ken Adams' sets appears so larger than life. Bond opening the little tag holding the confidential folder together when he does the hand in and sort of karate chops it open is admittedly something I still do to this day in my own life. So it's one of those images that's burned in my head and shows Bond's sort of casual flippance that's so key to the character. But again, you see him here piecing together in his head, okay, he just saw that guy dead the night before, and he's piecing together, okay, so he was in Nassau, here's this one connection we have, it's this girl, so that's what we're seeing in Bond's head, why he wants to go after her. And, of course, to most people, it's just going to seem, oh, well, as M says, do you think she's worth going after? I wouldn't have quite put it that way myself, Sha. But Bond presents it in a sort of understated way. You see him as an intelligence man. He is an intelligent person. He is piecing this stuff together and presenting his case as any operative would have to do. And it's fun here that it's undercut because, the guy was bored in the Vulcan last night. But here we see M's belief in Bond. He saw him at Shrublands last night and he was dead. That's enough for me to start making inquiries. We see that pop up later when he defends Bond, in front of the Home Secretary, essentially. Once again, this is M's office, and it's shot. Honestly, it is shot a little bit closer to what you see in Dr. No from Rush with Love, as opposed to how it looks in Goldfinger. But it is interesting seeing it in scope for the first time. There we got another editing wipe. We do get a number of those, but again, the editing style of the film isn't fully reliant on the wipes. It's just something that Peter Hunt does to try and change things up a bit, keep it from getting stale. I love the sort of awkwardness Bond has here. I think I had that when I come in. The way that Sean sort of pauses for a second. Of course, it's also interesting that he's changed suits by this time, so obviously that indicates the passage of time. Now, here's one of the best transitions in the series. The way that Sean sort of bends and he closes the door, John Barry's music comes in, and we immediately cut to the coral reefs of the Bahamas. Now, it must be said how vital John Barry's score is in Thunderball and how astonishing it is, his level of proficiency by this point in time. For Rush with Love was his first complete score for the Bond films, and then Goldfinger was already a step above in confidence. But when he scored Thunderball, if you look at the scores themselves, they not only increase in length and confidence and style and complexity, but I honestly think you could make the case for Thunderball being his best Bond score. I definitely think it's up there with You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and The Living Daylights as well, just for complexity. But Thunderball is the first time he's scoring not just for a film. The score for Thunderball is a score for an epic film. And I think that was something he recognized because Thunderball is a spectacle. It's larger than life. And his score matches that. John Barry's magic in scoring the Bond films was that whether he knew it intrinsically or whether it was just inherent or whether it was a conscious thing or not, his scores pick up on and understand the core context of what each film means, of what their soul is, as it were. So again, Thunderball as a score is a score for an epic film, even though this is not a giant, 78 millimeter roadshow. John Barry scored it as if it was. We have the first appearance of Domino, and similar to the way it's in Fleming's novel, but there's a lot of things that are tweaked and massaged and moved around. Another thing that I think makes people have pause about Thunderball and have some qualms and stuff, going back to the notion of there being too many cooks in the kitchen, I think that another issue is that Thunderball was always intended to be a film. It started out as a film treatment. It was rewritten and reworked many, many times. Then Fleming turned it into one of his novels, and while he brought so much of his usual wit and intelligence and inventiveness to it, even when you're reading the novel, you can't quite get away from that. So for me personally, it's, if I had to rank the novels in order of my preference, I love passages of Thunderball, but overall, you can still, I think, feel that intrinsic, other people's hands were in it. And you can feel it didn't start as a book. So originally, Richard Maybaum wrote a draft in 1961 because Thunderball was intended to be the first film in the series. But of course, it was tied up in legalities, and they realized much later on they didn't have the budget whatsoever to make it work. If you look there really quick in Domino's boat, there's a guy who comes up once it's being turned around, once they've gotten out, and to steer it around. That's one of the many continuity gaps you see, continuity errors, some people might call them. But there's a lot of little things like that some of them I do think were probably caused by, the production and the post process being so completely rushed. But also with multiple units going on at the same time, shooting all over the place. But there's a number of those, and it's sort of become a fun game to find them all, and then you chuckle at all of them. But anyway, so Richard Maybaum wrote his first Thunderball script in 1961, and I think you can find some passages of that, but if you read sort of about that, you can tell it was obviously written before Bond was established, especially pre-Dr. No. And of course, I don't know if they started fresh, or I believe they pulled that out of storage basically when they came to do Thunderball, but it was, they had more scripts written, and then Harry Saltzman had the writer John Hopkins come in and do writing on it, and then I think Richard Maybaum came back and did more rewriting, and of course there was all the on-set writing as well. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on, but you can tell it went through process after process, after draft, and then years went by, and then they're coming back to it after the films have become successful. So now they're having to take this story and all this work and treatments and drafts and conform it to the identity of the film series they've already created. So I think that's something very important to understand. The whole development process of Thunderball is a study in and of itself, and hasn't been really documented until recently. The shot of the boat coming up to the casino has that sort of gliding effect that I've always loved, and it matches to Barry's score. I think his cue here for the whole casino sequence is one of the most exquisite in the entire Bond canon. This is one of the cues on the soundtrack releases I've listened to on repeat countless times. If you look here very closely in the casino, you see the gentleman there with the mustache and the cigar. That is, of course, Kevin McClory himself making a cameo. And then when Bond goes into the casino, the woman he has trouble getting around, this little bit here, that's actually McClory's wife. So both of them got cameos. This is a wonderfully designed casino set. I've always loved the usage of the greens against the golds, and of course, it's very similar to what we get in Her Majesty's Secret Service. Of course, it's then redone as purple. Now, this, of course, is the first Bond and villain public confrontation, and it's done in a particular way because, Largo already knows about Bond because his associate Quist has been spying on him with Domino, but the way that Bond just charges in and immediately starts provoking and he's prodding Largo And of course, the line about inferencing Spectre is that jab, and then uses it again and again, and now he's going to best Largo and humiliate him at the gambling table, and with a casual flippancy that increases the damage even more, because as I said, Bond doesn't even care whatsoever, and he's just taking all this money off of Largo. So again, there's a psychological context that's always present in the Bond villain confrontation, but it's interesting how personal it becomes in Thunderball, with Domino being the kept woman and being the in between. So Largo is not just challenged as an agent of Spectre, but he's challenged as a man, and Bond picks up on this, and you see him reacting and using this. And that's why he plays this whole scene. Connery plays with such a flippancy, because he sees how it's getting to Largo, and he's playing on it to try and make for sure that it's convincing him that his hunch is right, that something is going on here, that he's on the right track. Because you have to keep in mind, Bond goes to Nassau and he's just following a hunch, because he could be on a wild goose chase, which is what most people back at the Home Office are convinced of. Of course, again, with Largo being dubbed, Claudine Auger, who plays Domino, was also dubbed. We see Felix Leiter again. There was another wipe usage there, and for the first time, Bond orders a Dom Perignon 55, because apparently the 53 was unavailable. Now, Domino as a character, it does have some more depth than what we had seen before, which is really refreshing. I think one of the unfortunate things that happens throughout the film series is that all of the heroines in Fleming's novels really get undercut, and they're not served as well, because, of course, it's a film, you don't have as much time as you do in a novel, and of course the focus is on Bond as the lead character. But I really do appreciate it when we get more depth and soul and character to the Bond women, because without that, they risk becoming more window dressing. And because of this, and not to mention how absolutely gorgeous that Claudine Auger looks throughout this film, and these amazing costumes and hairdos and everything as well, there's a certain romance, and the way that she closes her eyes there, and she automatically reads into something into Bond being there. It adds a certain emotional context. And when Largo comes back out, Vargas is there watching him, and then they come back over. The way that she says Amelia wants to leave, it shows that she is obviously, not in control of her own existence. So being just a kept woman, it's not just that. It goes much further than that. And she tries to deflect it with this flippancy, which, again, is in Fleming's novel, but this is one of the few times you see one of the Bond women maintain some of that. And again, this plays into the whole Bond and Largo not just facing off as Bond and villain, but as Bond versus man. He is also, as Dr. No says, hurting his pride. There in the background, you see Felix takes his glasses off, and he's actually talking to Bond a little bit. But of course, we haven't been introduced to Felix at this point. So he's this mysterious figure in the background. And this is all subject to what Peter Hunt did. This is where he reversed the order of scenes. This is Bond at the hotel. If you look, he's dressed the same way he was at the poolside scene with Domino. There he walked away from the hotel desk and went to the hotel desk. This is Peter Hunt having to play around, because originally he just walked to the desk and then walked across the lobby to the stairs. So what Peter Hunt did was he flopped the shot of the receptionist there so she could watch Bond go up the stairs in the correct direction, because he didn't have a shot of anything else. So apparently what he did was he had to cut big chunks out of the second act, and felt that he needed to reverse the order of the scenes by taking this scene and putting it after the casino scene to sort of bridge some gap, I would take it. But it is kind of weird once you notice it. It's a very weird thing, and Again, the only thing I can figure is that he had to cover something because the sequences had been removed. Now, there, if you look very closely, is of course the famous attaché case from Russia with Love, which we see pop up here, and of course was name checked in Goldfinger. But it's great to see that maintained somehow. Here's the wonderful little gadget of the room tape recorder hidden inside the large book. Again, this is a great moment where we get to see Bond put two and two together, but we're in with it. We're inside his thought process. The beautiful moment of the camera panning across from the door, across the carpet, to the bathroom. And of course, if you're Quist searching, searching Bond's room, I don't know why we immediately go into the bathroom, but or maybe he's waiting to jump Bond. Either way, you do get a nice moment there. If you look outside the window, you have an actual palm tree and things, a sense of scope and scale of it still being in Nassau, even though this is obviously a set at Pinewood. And I also love the doors being that sort of wood. Again, very similar to what Ken Adam did in sections of his Goldfinger sets as well. Now we're introduced to Felix, and of course he's dressed in the same clothes he was wearing when Bond and Domino got out of the boat, because of course this sequence came right after, wait till you get to my teeth, it would have gone to this sequence. Fun little introduction to Felix getting punched in the stomach. And this is one of the great self-assured Bond moments where he just disarms the man by scalding him and then smashing him with the door. And of course, Felix can only talk about their realities, but until Quist has been knocked out. And there's a nice dark tinge to, well, he killed him. Now, this scene is really wonderful because it shows Bond is being cold and cruel as he's supposed to be. But it's that key line, the little fish I throw back into the sea. It's, again, playing this game of chess with Largo. It's like, okay, that's been your move, now here's my move. And, of course, this is why Largo is so apprehensive of Bond when he appears at the casino. And, of course, in the edit we have, it's just like, oh, you're messing around with my girl. Oh, I've heard about you. Well, in the way it's supposed to be structured, we've already seen Quist bite the dust, and so Largo knows that Bond is some sort of enemy operative of sorts. So they're already onto each other's game by the time we get to the casino. We still get that in the film, but because of the reversing of scenes, it kind of confuses that a little bit. And this, of course, is one of the iconic moments. We have all of Largo's henchmen dressed in all black, which means poor Quist is not long for this world, as we're very much aware. And I love that this is mostly played out without dialogue. The hand gestures, he draws his finger across his throat, and then Largo just jerks his head. And then he kisses the ring in a sort of very mafia-like gesture. And then we see the sharks, and of course they're real sharks, and that's a real stuntman being thrown onto sharks. And Barry's score cuts to this haunting high wind note, and then the water slowly turns red. It's a very simple thing, but it's so chillingly effective. And it's that level of not just intelligence, but that level of what's the right word? That level of not going over the top, of pulling back some, that makes the death so much more impactful. And now we're introduced to both Paula Kaplan and Pinder and the sort of MI6 headquarters in the Bahamas hidden away. This is a really nice little set. If you look at it, the actual layout and the set dressing and everything is really very believable, even though we don't have any moving walls or secret compartments or things. And of course, we've gotten the signal that London is going ahead with Spectre's plan, and now we have the Q lab scene, but without a lab, and Q rather improbably dressed in a wonderful Hawaiian shirt. Now, of course, this is the first time Terrence Young is directing a Q scene, but, coming back with the sort of tone that Guy Hamilton established in Goldfinger, of the sort of, Bond and Q not exactly getting along, but still getting along. And here, the way that Sean plays it, it's got that childish flippancy. The way he plays with the dial, he turns the light on and off on the motorized scuba gear, and the way he's just prodding at Q, because they love each other to death, even though they would never admit it. And of course, they did use the Q scene as a cover scene, as it were, for when the weather got bad. They could go in and, we can do the Q scene now. And we're getting the various gadgets that will all come into play. And as established in From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, set up what you're going to do, give the audience the scoop on everything, and then do it. And perhaps the most ingenious device in the entire film is the miniature rebreather, which is really the signature gadget for Thunderball. And of course, it's so amazing that everybody thought it was real and led to the charming anecdote of the real-life Navy calling up and say, "How did you make that work?" "Oh, it's just a prop. Thank you, goodbye." Now, originally, this scene was apparently supposed to go on for a bit longer. Desmond Llewellyn talked about he really had a great moment that was cut out. So this apparently was another bit that Peter Hunt found in the second act to cut. So if you notice here, we immediately have a wipe. Now, this scene here, I'm pretty much convinced is another one that Peter Hunt switched around, because Bond is dressed in the same clothes he was in, and I believe this was supposed to come before that HQ scene, because I believe they were supposed to do that, check out the Disco Volante, and then they appear on the main street, and that's where Paula and Pinder come up. So I think that may be another example of Peter Hunt switching the placement. I may be wrong, but that's just my own feeling on that. Now we cut back, of course, the home office, where we're getting the actual advancement of the plot. Suspense is being built up more by the sheer cost of what Spectre is asking for. The tensions are being raised. The clock is ticking. But this does tend to take a back seat every time we cut back to Bond and Nassau, because you have to keep in mind there is a ticking clock before Doomsday, and they're going to have to pay up anyway, which is what these scenes are here to remind you of. And then Bond having a lead suggests, we might have something, which sets up later on, when it doesn't pan out at first, him having to stick up for Bond following his hunches. I still think the orangish red scuba wetsuit jackets are so unbelievably iconic. Now, I think it also has to be said, I do think Thunderball is probably the iconic water film. I don't think any other film is so associated completely with water, and even the mere mention of Thunderball brings water to mind. And, scuba diving was still a relatively new thing in 1965. It wasn't something that everybody went and did on the weekends. And there is a certain exotic quality, and I think it matches very well with the absolutely breathtaking passages in Fleming's novels where Bond would swim underwater, such as the fantastic sequence in Live and Let Die, the novel. And the state of underwater photography was still very much in its infancy, particularly for motion pictures. If you look at films, really the only big underwater film pre-Thunderball you have is Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where they obviously weren't in modern scuba gear, and they didn't have giant hand-to-hand fights going on. So there's a certain time capsule quality about that, but there's also an immediate visceral quality, because it's real guys underwater in scuba tanks, literally struggling with just daggers and spear guns, ripping masks off, and cutting air hoses, as we're going to see here. So you see it's tight quarters, and John Barry's music comes in to pump that tension. So while it can slightly look slow on screen, there's a visceral quality that really makes you think, what would it be like if you're struggling hand to hand with a guy underwater? There's a brutality to it as well. And Largo retaliates by just dropping hand grenades, which has got to be really brutal. Now here, seeing Bond snap away with the camera is what, of course, cues in Largo in the climax of the film, when Domino suddenly turns up with a very suspiciously similar-looking camera that, he puts two and two together because he's seen that camera before, where Bond is taking pictures of the underwater hatch. I've always loved how John Barry's score matches the grenade drops. That wah-wah is like the aftershock of the grenade explosion underwater. And there's a nice little bit of camera shake as well. And then, of course, everybody gets overzealous and they just start chunking them everywhere, which is a nice touch. And again, there's an element of danger here because Bond is having to swim away for his life now, and he's having to try and hide, and, he's almost gotten knocked out by grenades. It was supposed to be a simple thing where he swims up under the boat and takes some pictures, but obviously he's overmatched, and he's having to retreat now that he's got the photographs that he needed. And another thing that, once again shows that these are not meant to be trifled with, they do spot him and they come back. But to show Bond's ingenuity, he uses the fact that they hit his tanks to use a ruse that they've killed him. So by dropping the broken tank and the face mask and everything, allows him to get away, makes Largo convinced that maybe we did kill him. So it's a nice changing of the stakes. It's a nice, pulling the rug a little bit out from underneath the villain, and again showing Bond's ingenuity and the fact that he just held his breath there. Now we get that's a really well done wipe going the opposite direction now as Bond comes up. So a lot of the wipes are actually quite invisible. You don't even realize they're there. That's what a wipe is supposed to do. And now Bond has barely managed to get away and then nonchalantly just tosses everything away. And here we get Bond introduced to Fiona Volpe, of course, in a Ford Mustang, because Ford introduced the Mustang on Goldfinger, which was brand new at the time. So this was another way of Ford having their participation deal and it being a nice, plug for Mustangs. And I've also loved that it's the nice aqua teal color to match Fiona's outfit. This is a wonderfully directed and staged little playful moment of suspense. It's obviously, on the Pinewood lot. It's a process shot, but they have fun with it. And the way that Fiona very coldly starts to speed and basically get up to completely ludicrous speeds on this windy little road without any hesitation completely shows you that she is a match for Bond. She is dangerous. And there's also a certain eroticism and a certain sexual charge that, again, goes to that notions that, Bond is, he has to be on his guard and she even completes the one-liners. That's another touch. And they banter back and forth. So this is like a highly tense version of the scene in Goldfinger where Bond is sort of interrogating Tilly Masterson in the DB5. And then John Barry comes in as she crosses the 100-mile-an-hour mark. And it's only at the finale of this sequence where the music builds and they go faster and faster and faster. And there's a little bit of speeding up of the film and Bond holding the nonchalant look and then piling on the braking sound effect and the undercutting with the humor of it being the same hotel and obviously being a complete setup. And Bond is in on the joke, but plays along with it because, of course, he's having to unfold Spectre's plan by practically walking into it. And again, we get about 4 one-liners there because the way that they show Fiona being one of the deadliest fiends Bond has ever come across is she can keep up in the one-liner department. Again, I think another thing that dates back to there being so many writers and scripts and things, we keep getting scenes like this where we're having to unfold the plot more and we cut back to, okay, now we're developing the pictures. It's an underwater hatch. Well, yeah, we already saw that, And now we're getting the first helicopter search for the Vulcan. They did a number of, shots in the helicopter of the actors and things for the 2 major sequences we have of the searching. But because Peter Hunt had to sort of mix and match between some of those, that causes some pretty famous continuity jumps where, Felix Leiter's clothes change from shorts to long pants. And so that's just another sign of there being a lot of footage and very, very little time to stitch the film together and meet that, finally December, Christmas '65 release date. Another victim, I think, of the cutting in the second act is that Martine Beswick comes back to the series after From Russia with Love as Paula, but doesn't really have a whole lot to do. And I think that character's the biggest victim of all of the cuts made in the second act. Now, this is just a delicious scene of Largo and Fiona discussing Bond, and Fiona rightly points out, okay, Largo's concerned. He tries to make love to your woman. And of course, if you had killed him, then the British government would know that, something was up and the bombs were probably here because their best man had just been killed mysteriously. And her cold, vindictive, murderous quality is underlined by, her being a perfect shot and calling out to send the targets and then cutting it off with, "I shall kill him." And Largo has that quiet quality where he just studies her, and then he's like, all right, it's like a caged tiger, you just have to let it go. And Bond knows immediately that it's Palmyra because it's a shark-infested pool. This is a wonderful little quiet moment. Again, Thunderball's full of these, and it allows Bond to see Fiona's Mustang. So, of course, he knows that she's here, which is why he then prods Largo later on about having visitors, and that gun looks more fitting for a woman, things like that. So, again, it's Bond pushing continually at Largo, prodding him, not just with Domino, but about the plot, about Spectre, about the bombs, about Fiona, just everything he can use to provoke Largo into letting something important drop, to give him more information. And of course, coming on to Domino here again is a calculated thing. And then you notice Domino turns away sort of as a reaction because Largo comes up. And then Largo turns, and that beautiful little bit of staging where the gun is pointing at Bond and he pushes it away a little bit. And the little about women is one of the cutest Bond lines. This is a really interesting bit here where Largo, says, "I thought you might have met Mr. Vargas the other night." Of course, meaning the Disco Volante, but, obviously on the surface meaning the casino. And then he really interestingly talks about Vargas basically, not having any interests or passions and insinuating that the only thing that he enjoys in life is killing people. The way that the actor Philip Locke is under sunglasses and he finally looks down in a way that the implication is fully there. So there's no doubt about it that Vargas is a very messed up individual. And the passionate man line joke is paid off here by Domino being framed on the left, and then we have a slight rack focus onto her. Now, Largo showing Bond around is where we get to the most famous drop sequence of the film, where, Largo shows Bond around Palmyra and then was originally giving him a tour of the Disco Volante. This is another one of the great Bond moments where it says, "Seems terribly difficult," turns around and fires almost without looking from the hip and hits the clay target with perfect accuracy. And then Largo just says, "No," with that slight twinge. They know exactly what each other's game is, but they have to keep up this charade. And in some certain ways, there's a certain enjoyment on both sides. Largo's very prideful. He's basically getting to boast about everything. Sort of the talking killer syndrome that Roger Ebert liked to write about. But it adds, again, a certain human quality, just like the Bond and Domino relationship. There's a direct confrontation that's emotional and egotistical and prideful. So, of course, again, this is where Largo would take Bond and Domino on board the Disco Volante and walk them around on a tour, and Bond would continually check at the Geiger counter watch to see if the bombs were there. And that was completely dropped. And there are some stills that survive, but that's the most well-known sequence that was dropped. Again, it shows just, I think, how much scissoring and restructuring had to go on this in the second act, which I think was Peter Hunt really having to focus on how to get this down to around 2 hours, not a lot of time, and how to solve the sort of not lumbering, but there is a certain slowness that comes up in the second act. And when you really start to look at it, you can't really do anything for the first act. You can't really drop anything, and you can't drop anything in the third act. But it's the second act where you have to try and pull things around and make it work. And now Paula will make her exit from the film. And I love how Fiona is the more, basically, definitely the boss of the outfit and having to, order the goons around. This is the first appearance of the Junkanoo Parade, which was actually restaged for the film. They got everybody to come back out, and normally this was done once a year, but everybody got so into it, they did it for, I believe, at least 2 nights, and just tried to get all the footage they could. And there's also some scenes in the trailer, if you look very closely, here this little balcony where Bond and Domino are looking at the Junkanoo. Well, they're supposedly waiting for Largo, and there is some footage of Adolfo Celli up there in character. So I believe there were some scenes that were shot there with Largo at the Junkanoo that were also dropped from the second act. I always love the slight quality of this scene where Felix is like, James, Paulo's gone. It's like, well, what do we do now? I don't know. That was a very quick wipe there. Again, there are wipes throughout the film, but they're not everywhere, as some people say. And this sets up the infiltration into Palmyra. Now, the slight push in onto the map with the really dramatic cue and then the fade transition into Bond sneaking around is a really lovely moment. And the way that Barry scores with the, I guess it's xylophone, with the footage of Sean creeping around cat-like around the walls and things, I think is perfectly capturing his spirit of movement. Love how Largo discusses, interrogation, Paul just, having a normal, relaxed night. And of course, Bond's plans are foiled because, of course, Largo has emergency generators. So again, it puts Bond back in mortal peril, and it's something he didn't anticipate. So it is a level of danger that, Bond has broken in. He's used the lack of power to be able to break into, Largo's fortress, as it were. And now the lights are going to come back on, and now he's like, oh, damn. So it's a level of, okay, now Bond could potentially be very easily caught. And Paula becomes our sacrificial lamb for the film. And I love that, everybody's first inclination is that Vargas killed her. He's like, nope, I didn't. She must have taken cyanide. Dang it, I was looking forward to killing her. I've also loved the fact that there's the ever-convenient little concrete block, and Bond immediately just lays down on the ground. This is a wonderful moment where Paula's body is just there, so sadly draped in the chair, and all Bond can do is just have that one mournful look, and then he has to turn away. Of course, the hatch door there closes silently. And of course, now it's already closed again. That's another one of the little continuity bits that all of us love finding. Bond starting the little fight here is one of the great, cute moments where he fires at one side and fires at the other and gets them shooting at each other. And then Largo has to scream to get everybody to stop. And if you notice, he causes some of them to actually shoot each other. So he's, gotten some of the opposition to kill each other. So that's a wonderful little bit of Bond character. But again, he's not infallible. He drops the PPK and it fires, giving away his position. So again, you do see Bond in mortal peril throughout Thunderball. It is a direct return to Bond still as a human being of Dr. No and From Russia with Love. He can make mistakes. He can be hurt. He can bleed. He can be injured, which he is in several times throughout Thunderball. And that is a very important thing, which makes this moment all the more impactful, because they're going to fall into the pool, and then Largo will close the hatch over them. And then, again, Barry wisely only comes in with a big crash moment when the guy jumps him, and then when the hatch closes. And if you notice, they barely make it under. before the metal grates close right over their heads. There's a nice little rustling as their bodies hit that. And, of course, they can't break out. Another cool thing, if you look, Bond uses one of his... I used to think it was one of the shoe knives from the Fleming novels, but it's obviously a knife from a scabbard. And, of course, blood always looks amazing underwater. Now, this was the real tunnel they built, and those are real sharks. This sets up a moment from the production which is really hairy. Of course, it's not always Connery underwater. There are some stuntmen, but they put some plexiglass up to keep Sean and the stuntmen away from the sharks as they're going through. But they, as Ken Adams said, they couldn't get a certain section. So there's like, okay, well, there's one spot the sharks can get through, but they won't go that way. And, of course, that's exactly what the shark did. So there's the moment coming up here where you can see Sean literally crap his pants because that's really a shark coming for him. And it's coming up in just a moment. Because most of the shots, you see him hold his hands. It's right here where he looks back and forth. And then it cuts to the shot here where you see the guy and you see the hands up because, of course, it's plexiglass. Now, this is one of the bits in the different audio mixes that comes across as different. In one mix, that's the mono version that is listed, he says, "No, you can tell about the one that got away." Whereas in the alternate mix, he has a different one-liner, which is, of course, "Sorry, old boy, better luck next time." That's an easy way to identify which audio mix of the film you're listening to. And, of course, that one usually turns up because it was used as the basis of the stereo remix in 1995 and has carried over ever since. And the sort of passage of time is a little weird here in these sequences because, of course, Bond was at the Junkanoo, then he went to Palmyra, and now they're gonna go back into the Junkanoo. So we're like in and out of that. But, of course, as Fiona later says, the music is gonna go on all night. Now, the way that Sean plays this scene where he finds Fiona in the bath, it's a really, for lack of a better term, it's a very steamy scene. You don't see any nudity, of course, but Fiona laying there and in the bath, and you see her bare back and everything. It's just enough. And the inherent humor makes it all the more interesting. And I've always felt that Sean plays this with a sort of tinge of classic Cary Grant from a screwball comedy where, he comes in, it's like, especially when he says, "Hello there," and he just sits down nonchalantly, drapes his arms over the chair, and hands her a pair of shoes to put on. It's another one of these beautiful moments where each person knows exactly what the other person's game is, but they're having fun and at playing through the charade, and of course are going to continue the fun in the bed, as it were. And the little glances, Bond seeing the Spectre ring, This, of course, is where Sean said, as Bond, this for the first time, "the things I do for England," which is cut there. You see his lips start to say it as the wipe goes up. It was maintained in the trailer, but I think it was very wise to cut that because, of course, Bond is not supposed to be outed as a spy. So in Thunderball, if he said, "Oh, the things I do for England," it would be saying, "Oh, yeah, I work for MI6. Now, this scene is really one of the most overtly sexual of the entire series. The way that Fiona bites his shoulder, and then the way that she fondles the headboard, the bars of the bed and everything, and then her voice chokes off. It's, again, extraordinarily sensual. And then Peter Hunt has a very funny cutaway to the very obviously phallic horn coming in and blowing really, really high in the soundtrack to cut you right out of it. And it makes it last just long enough to then fade back. And then Fiona says, "You make a shocking mess out of my hair, you sadistic brute." And it's kind of fun that both have sort of suited up for battle at this point after having a lovemaking tryst on the bed. Bond says, "We can have a little talk on the way. You may find it interesting." Fiona says, "I hate to think I'm going to miss anything." And, of course, it's been reversed. Now she's going to have the talk. And, of course, Bond realizes that, of course, he's been outplayed and now has to continue the charade. Now, this is one of the key monologues. This was Not only everybody having a little bit of fun at the criticism that they got on Goldfinger with Pussy Galore magically being converted in her allegiance by one tryst with Bond in the hay, but it's a really strong monologue for Fiona, throwing all of James Bond's, ego right back at him. Bond says, "What I did tonight was for king and country. You don't think you gave me any pleasure, did you?" And Fiona throws it right back at him without hesitation. "I forgot your ego, Mr. Bond." And this is exactly about the criticism. Pussy Galore, got with Bond one time and magically became a goodie. It's like it's a little hard to believe, and I don't know. It's always made me absolutely adore Fiona as a character even more. It's such a shame she has to get killed. And you see, Bond is completely cornered on all sides, and they have to play at this rock because they're going to go out the front. They have to keep up public appearances. But, Bond is caught here. He is a prisoner and has to find some way out. And the obvious, implication is that, he is going to be killed. And the way he figures out here, it's presented so well, and it shows once again that Bond is an ingenious character not to be trifled with. The using of the guy's alcohol bottle, and of course Fiona unwisely decides to light a cigarette at this moment. You see John Barry starting to come in with the first strains of the street chase cue, which pumps this scene up, and we cut immediately to Bond jumping out after the smoke goes off. You see poor George Leach's arm is on fire, and right there, that's a very clever moment. Bond gets hit in the leg, but Peter Hunt has flopped the image to create Bond running in the right direction, which causes confusion later. Bond will bandage the other leg because that shot was flopped. And this sets up the street chase with the blood from Bond's leg wound, giving them a trail to follow. Although you would think it would be a bit harder to follow in reality in the middle of this giant Junkanoo parade. And here in a minute, if you look very carefully, is the most infamous cameo appearance in the film, which is the stray dog right there giving a nice whiz in the middle of a fence, which is something Peter Hunt dropped in the editing, but everybody loved it so much that even the producers, Broccoli and Saltzman, demanded he had to put back. You don't notice it at first, but it's one of those absolute magical in-jokes. Here again, you have to pay attention. Bond is in mortal danger. He is running for his life. He's wounded. He's been shot in the leg. He's bleeding. He's outnumbered, and he's really having to run for it. Again, you didn't get anything like this in Goldfinger. So again, the stakes have been raised, and as soon as Terrence Young comes back, the danger becomes fully visceral and real again. And that's such an important, essential quality to any Bond film that you have to maintain it. You have to do that because otherwise the audience investment is not there. If it's not as vital, you can play with it, you can dial it back some, but you have to maintain that. And of course, Bond seeks refuge and finds it on a float full of scantily clad beautiful ladies. It's, of course, a humorous touch. It's an in-joke, but it doesn't go too far. And as the cue gets to its dramatic peak, Bond is able to make his escape and just, as a latch ditch, dive through everyone, which is probably the best shot you ever get of Bond's rear end, amusingly. And you see he's already limping away, and the score picks up on the last moment here, building the tension where Bond will run right into a jump scare. And Peter Hunt picked up on this and tried to improve on it for the ice rink scene in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. If you look very carefully, that whole sequence is staged as a direct redo, as it were, of this whole moment in Thunderball. Of course, the club is named the Kiss Kiss Club after the original title song, Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. This is where Bond will go in and sort of bandage his wound, but as you see, he does the left leg, whereas originally in the shot we saw, it's the right leg. That's all because Peter Hunt, in the editing, flopped it to make it match where Bond was running to in the main shot. I've always loved that piece that John Barry came up with, that incidental music. And of course, now we set up the astonishing death of Fiona sequence, both in the music, the editing, the staging. This is one of the supreme moments of not just the film, not just the three Terrence Young films, but the entire Bond series in general. And you want to talk about great moments in cinematic construction. Every single element of this sequence is perfection. Right down to the dialogue that the extra has here, and the way that Bond plays it off. You're mad. Yes, isn't everyone? And then Fiona appears. You should have told me your wife was here. It's that level of humor that undercuts things, but then Fiona comes in close, and the tension is just ramped up, and we see all of Largo's henchmen start to encroach inward slowly. And eventually, we will see, along with Bond, that two of them disappear, which sets up Bond being able to spot the gun from behind the stage through the curtains. And we see it here. And the way that Connery looks, we follow over. So we are in Bond's eye view at that point. So this is how he knows that, somebody's going to come from behind the curtain. We don't know exactly what right now, but we know something is coming. And Fiona looks over, so this is a well-stitched together little plan that's popped up. That's, of course, not going to pay off well. But the way that Bond is turned away there, and we start to pick up the cutting, and then they move along nonchalantly. But, Peter Hunt there stole that earlier shot of the two that are now behind the curtain. So that's a little cheat. And then rapid succession of shots, intercut with the bongos, and then finally stopped. And the music comes back at a slower pace to reveal that Fiona's been shot at the very last moment. And the fingers go open, and then Bond covers it with her boa before she's just dead. Always found it interesting that all of Largo's henchmen let Bond go at that point, but I guess it was not the intended idea to kill the Spectre point man, as it were. It was a big whoops moment. I've always felt that wipe there is a bit interesting because if you notice, it's a complete wipe to black and then another wipe. So that's I think the biggest wipe in the film if you're talking about the transitional effects, because it has to give a big transition of time, because now we're going back to the home office and there's far less time and they haven't found anything. Now right there next to Lois Maxwell's Moneypenny is Charles Rouchon, who is the very famous American who was in the armed forces and helped so many of the early Bond films get so much military aid and equipment. It was he, for example, that helped get a lot of the equipment for Thunderball, helped get permissions to get to Fort Knox, which is why he has a name check there. So it's really cool he gets a cameo. Now this, of course, is the second search for the Vulcan. And coming up here in a second, there's going to be the shot of the manta ray with this line, manta ray, unusual to see him as far out as this, which is only heard in the mono track, as it's called. It's not heard in the other mix because apparently, if you listen closely, it sounds like it's the voice of Pinder, who is not in the helicopter at all. So that's why it was probably dropped for the other mix. It's another one of the handful of audio differences you get. Once again, if you look closely at all these scenes, you will notice that Felix's outfit changes from shorts to pants all the time. Now, you notice Bond pauses when Felix says Golden Grotto because he's automatically making the connection. Sharks, Golden Grotto, those are the same sharks that Largo has. So that's what clues Bond in. We need to search this area, and that's, of course, what leads him to the Vulcan. So again, everything is intelligently done. Everything is there for a reason, and you can see Bond stitching everything together. He's putting all the puzzle pieces together throughout the film. Again, Bond does have to solve a puzzle. He has to prove that all this is there, and he has to prove that it's Largo, and he has to prove by finding the Vulcan. This is another interesting touch. Felix shoots one of the sharks to keep the others away. It is a very dangerous moment, and again adds to the tension. These are real sharks, but I don't think they shot a real shark, but I've always wondered how they got that. Most of the sharks they had for the film, if you listen to all the production materials, everybody had to go out and, they had to actually capture sharks and, get them in position and let them go and try and get the shots. So, Gotta be really nerve-wracking working with live sharks underwater in the ocean. So, that adds such a layer of believability and reality, and just puts you really on edge when you see the shark gnawing through the camouflage netting and then just swim right past. And then in a second, when the shark comes up into the Vulcan bomber set. Another funny anecdote is when they did that, apparently the shark is too big, so it doesn't even. They had to get him all the way up into the cockpit. They had to open it up because he was like a 15-foot long shark, and it was too big for the plane set. And of course, they really did submerge this set. They made it as realistic as possible, and they really sank it in the ocean. And so eventually, when they finished the film, they did break it up, but they left the framework, which has become a new coral reef. So ostensibly, you can find the correct area in the Bahamas and find whatever is maybe left of the Vulcan bomber, which is something I've admittedly would always have always wanted to go and do. Of course, here Bond takes off the identifiers of Domino's brother. I've always loved if you look very closely on the wrist, there's already some calcification on the corpse, which is just, it's a very minor thing, but I think it adds so much to the believability of this sequence. And of course, again, there's that shark coming up, so it does add some tension that Bond has to get out of there. So there's a very large shark coming in a very confined space. Again, there's a nice otherworldly quality that I think you would always get, under the water at that depth, especially with sharks swimming around. Of course, in the novel, that is Domino's brother and not a double, but Bond will confront Domino with the evidence of her brother's death, even though obviously he took that stuff off of his double and not her actual brother. But those are small details; they don't quite matter. Her brother was still murdered anyway. Now, again, with all the Bond and Domino scenes, there's underwater in particular. This one, most of all, it's just so incredibly, poetic in a way. This shot of Domino swimming upwards over the camera and then Bond coming to meet her, and then when they meet and go underneath the coral here with the sun shining through and an embrace, it's just absolutely hypnotic. And then the explosion of bubbles goes off. It's just a beautiful moment. It's absolutely indescribable. Yes, it's a little impractical, but again, combined with the sunlight coming through and the way that Barry scores it, it's just a beautiful moment. And originally they did have a take where apparently they let the bikini top fly up, but that was deemed too much, and I really think it is too much. I have to comment, I've always thought the costuming in this film is really interesting, and particularly I've always thought the Domino's bikini here, the alternating black and white bikini, is a really interesting, beautiful design. This, of course, is right out of the novel from the chapter How to Eat a Girl. And some have pointed it's a really nice literal translation of Bond's one-liner earlier, wait till you get to my teeth. And, of course, the emotional content of this scene as well, because this is where Bond confronts Domino with her brother's death and, the fact that he's been using her, really. I mean, that's the whole context of the scene. And it's nice to see that at first Domino, thinks, oh, well, you're going away. That's what you come to say. And then Bond says it's about your brother, and she immediately freezes. And without saying anything, she sees the dog tag and the watch in his hand and immediately knows that something has happened. And the score is very, very haunting but faint, starts to creep in. And Bond lets Domino piece everything together. And he doesn't immediately hit her with everything, but you can see there's hesitation on his face. They do have an actual bond that is outside of just the typical lust attraction. And Bond here, he puts sunglasses on. He is having to armor up, as it were. He's having to really hurt her, and he doesn't want to. But, he has to hide his eyes. And it's interesting that this is the point at which Vargas finds them and starts observing them. So this extremely emotional moment for Domino, the point at which she decides to betray the man who controls her and keeps her living in fear. The moment where she fully gives over to this strange man who's come out of nowhere and totally turned her life upside down. The moment that she finds out her brother has been murdered, is being observed by the very man she's going to go up against and fears so much. And here you can see Domino's resolve, which of course comes up in the climax when she does kill Largo. And again, it is very helpful that we've gotten so much of an increase in the Bond girl character, as it were, because that establishes more of a audience trust with the character and interest. And of course, it's she who spies Vargas, because otherwise, he could have gotten the drop on Bond and has already screwed on the silencer. And Bond's cold-blooded killing with the spear gun of Vargas is one of the iconic Bondian moments, and I think you got the point, is one of the 5 or 10 best Bond liner quips that's just tossed off with aplomb. And of course, this sets up the fact that Domino's already overstayed her time limit and has to get back. There's an element of danger, and Bond has to cover up that Vargas has been killed. And there's an interesting use. It's a mix here of location photography and stage photography. So obviously they had to do a lot of the closer shots as pickups in the studio later on. Now this is a really interesting transition shot, a moment actually. Peter Hunt takes Domino's conversation with Bond about the seaside steps and lets it play out over transition and starts to echo it off. So that way we don't have to hear her getting in the car talking about, oh yeah, there's this thing, maybe you could go in this way, but we're already moving with it, and it's got this nice sort of spectral, ghost-like effect of her voice, saying there are steps going down to the sea, and Largo never allows strangers to go near it. And we once again get to see how well Sean can just creep around, again, with that cat-like grace, and start to break his way into the plot at large and infiltrate Largo's setup. And of course, we, like Bond at this point, have no idea what's going on here, so we're having to piece it together with him. We're participating, which is the most important thing. And that's why Bond has that sort of confused look on his face. He's piecing things together. He has to glance at what time it is. And he here at this point takes the tracking device pill, which will set up in the climax how he's found later on the Coast Guard helicopter. Of course, right there he's wearing the Rolex, which, of course, later on he'll be seen wearing the Geiger counter watch. So that's another little continuity thing everybody likes to point out. Bond explaining to Domino that the camera is a Geiger counter. We didn't get that set up before, so I've always wondered that may be one of the things that was cut out of the Q scene, because it's just described as an underwater camera. And again, Largo saw it before. Now that shot of Connery is obviously from earlier in the scene, but it's been repeated and darkened down because Bond has obviously been lying in wait, but that seems like an exact steal from before, because remember, Bond had to go out of that alcove, cross the little land bridge, go down the stairs, because it's set up as if he's hiding back there. So that was a stolen shot. And of course, Bond infiltrates with ease. Considerable ease, actually. You have to wonder what happens when the guy wakes up. And of course, when they dove in there, that's very shallow, and then the cutaways are in much deeper water. Again, I know everybody likes to complain that the underwater sequences run on very long, but really, they're actually rather short until you get to the climax. I've never done like a rough tally of the actual minute count, but if you look at each individual underwater scene, none of them are very long. They all move at a very good clip. That's another stolen shot there. That's actually stolen from later on, where Bond is in front of the door that closes inside the hidden bomb area. So that's another that Peter Hunt stole to put there to give proper moving continuity. And you can just take it as Bond being at the underwater hatch as it closes. And of course, everybody else has taken off their mask. Bond hasn't. So there again, that's where Bond looks at the Geiger counter watch instead of the Rolex that he had on before. Nice fast wipe transition, and another one to quickly show that the Disco Volante is already gone, the 6 hours out, or 3 hours out, as it were. And of course, now is where we will get the reveal of where the bombs have been hidden. Bond has placed himself in mortal peril by infiltrating, and every single close-up shot adds to that tension because we see Connery's face there, we see Bond in the Spectre Frogman outfit with all the others, and it's a miracle that he's able to pass himself off for as long as he does, and really only because it's underwater. And so again, he's using his ingenuity, he's pressing his luck, and that again builds the entire sequence up in suspense levels, because we know at any second somebody could take a glance and see that it's Bond, which of course is what Largo does later on, just right after this sequence. Now, they did find a real cave and alcove, but this whole little construction of the bomb doors inside the wall is really well done. And of course, it all had to be done underwater. And we have the great climactic moment where we finally see the bomb. So everything that Bond has done to this point is leading to this exact moment. He has accomplished his mission. He has figured out, who Spectre's agents are, where the bombs are, and he's literally done it. But now, how does he get them away? How does he solve this problem? He's in with the group, but now what's he going to do? Which is another upping of the suspense. And again, he could have made it all the way back to the Disco Volante had he not looked over rather lazily in a way, and Largo spotted him. It's right here. You have to wonder, it's like, why does Bond look up so slowly? And then he looks looks away. And here is another moment in the music cues of the film being different. This one's not dialogue, it's music. This whole sequence of the fight in the bomb cavern, in the older mono mix, the first version, it is completely silent. It's just played over with sound effects. And in the other version, it is played out with a reprise of the pre-title sequence music from the fight in the chateau. And actually very noticeably like it's tracked on. It's like it's a drop in quality if you pay attention. So I don't know if it was missed on the first one, and I kind of like it in both ways, both with and without music. I'm not sure which I prefer. That shot of Bond against the wall was, of course, stolen from earlier in the fight, and here we have Bond come up to the door, and now we get the moment that was stolen for earlier where he's outside the Disco Volante's underwater hatch. So now Bond has been locked away in the bomb cavern. His oxygen is running out, and he's been beaten up a bit. His wetsuit is torn, and how's he going to get out of here? So Largo's left him to what everybody feels is certain death, and, that's why... Bond is no longer a problem, so as far as Largo is concerned, or so he thinks. And again, because Domino has more of a role to play here, the fact of her getting caught, this whole sequence has more suspense to it because we've been allowed to feel for her more. There's more at stake, and she is in over her head, but she proceeds anyway because she's out for revenge. I've also often wondered why Bond doesn't give Domino the watch, which is, a quiet Geiger counter instead of one that clicks around like crazy. So that's just a fun little bit. And, of course, Largo looks down and sees the camera, which he recognizes as being Bond's camera. And, of course, the giveaway is the Geiger counter going off. And immediately, because Largo is the lead villain, he puts everything together. He knows that Vargas is dead. And so now he's going to have to get every bit of information out of Domino. And he alludes to the fact that Bond is already dead. And the transition here, the slamming of the door, now you're caught, slam of the door, immediately cut back to Bond. It's another one of the great transitional edits that Peter Hunt does. And it's got that nice bit of drama to it. And again, showing Bond's ingenuity, he swims around long enough and finds a tiny passage out, which, of course, you have to wonder, okay, if Spectre hid the bombs there, you would think they would check it out, make sure there wasn't some way to get to them, because apparently Bond just swims like a couple feet back there, and there's a little alcove, and you can just swim up and, I know it's a deserted place, but you have to think if somebody had gone there and, gone diving in that little water hole, they go turn a corner and it's like, oh, what's this? have to hope that maybe that's why Spectre came up with the phosgene gas and you only live twice. Now here's another audio difference. If you listen to Largo, he says what Bond knew in one mix and what Bond knows in the other mix. So in the mono, he says what Bond knew, and that alludes to the fact that he thinks he's already killed Bond by abandoning him there. Whereas in the other mix, he says, if you don't tell me what Bond knows. So that's a little bit of difference. That's the one change that isn't listed in the official documentary piece. It's something that I finally noticed after years of watching the film. But yeah, in the mono version, he says what Bond knew, which is pretty nice because, of course, at this point, Largo thinks that he's killed Bond. Here's another great transitional edit. No one to rescue, close the door, cut back to Bond, seemingly helpless, just sitting there. And I've always loved John Barry's cue having that sort of lilt and that sort of prelude to action, if you will, because Bond is just stuck there. Of course, the Coast Guard helicopter usage with Felix Leiter on board, they're in the Bahamas, but it immediately makes one think of the opening of License to Kill, of course, in Key West. And now even the Berry pistol will come into play. So it's a good thing Bond carried it with him day and night, although how he carried the watch and the Berry pistol in the swimming trunk trousers he had in before, I don't exactly know. Must have very deep pockets. Of course, even for 1965, a Coast Guard rescue via winch and everything was, again, very novel. That's the thing. Certain items are now commonplace, or you've seen a million times in other productions in all the years since, but you have to keep in mind this was still larger-than-life reality, things that most audiences were not exposed to at this point. And there's this wonderful, heroic charge in the music as Bond rises up, and then he reaches the helicopter and it sort of crescendos, because at this point Bond has accomplished his mission. He passes on the information, get your radio man onto Miami Beach. So he knows where the bombs are, he knows Largo has them, he knows where the target is and where the bomb is being moved to. So that sets up the climax and the aquaparas and everything. So, the aquaparas. So yeah, again, that's an important moment that gets overlooked because it's just delivered there in dialogue really quick. But but now we have to get the bombs back, and that sets up the climactic final underwater battle, and even the staging of the placement of all the divers. If you look, it's so beautifully laid out to maximize the Panavision 235 widescreen frame. Again, another transition from the air bubbles there. And we hear the sound of the planes before we see anything. And then we see the first of the parachutes start to come down. And then John Barry goes for broke. He really does. On the wide shot here with the city seemingly of Miami in the background. This is just beautiful, beautiful footage that is so vital to give the epic scale to set up the final climax. I don't know if there is a more you are there moment in the entire series than the finale. And here you even have some really great on the surface of the water shots. And there Peter Hunt uses the crash of the wave over the camera to fully cut underwater. And of course, really, you wouldn't get anything like that again until 10 years later on Jaws, putting the camera right there on the water level itself, on the surface. Sound plays such an important part of the early Bond films, and Thunderball in particular. Norman Wanstall really outdid himself with the sound design here. He won the Oscar for Goldfinger very deservedly, but could have won it again easily for Thunderball. Once you've seen the film, you never forget the effects of the spear guns, the air hoses, the actual scuba tanks. They just burn themselves into your brain and enmesh themselves perfectly with John Barry's score, and so they don't compete with each other, they become one. And it's really interesting here, the score drops out. Now, Peter Hunt did say he had cut the sequence originally to last about 3, 4, or 5 minutes, and after all the efforts everybody had gone to and all the massive amounts of footage that had been shot, the producers and everybody insisted that he put stuff back in and make it even bigger and go for broke. So against his better judgment, he would always say that, he went and put it back longer, so it's more like 10 or 12 minutes really. And I think this is the point where people really want to criticize the battle and say it's all too much underwater. Bond's line about "and the kitchen sink," I think, is inherently the most key line in the film, because you could make the argument Thunderball is where the kitchen sink came into play, because Thunderball had everything and was a big gargantuan production, and again is the point where it became about being a spectacle. So it was literally "and the kitchen sink" and everything you can think of. Now the music comes back in, and that sort of epic build with the parachutes going off, the crash into the water. Then we start the battle, but the music is gone. Then we have to wait for Bond to come in. Then he jumps in, and then the music starts again. It does create a sort of discordant moment, because it's like, oh, we've started the battle, and then, oh wait, no, we stopped again. We paused, and now we're fully back into it. So I think that's another thing that causes people to say, oh, well, they go around underwater forever. It is a little weird, and I do think that is probably also, again, because this sequence was re-edited and extended when originally Peter Hunt cut it down to a much tighter sequence. And of course, when you look at this, in just overall story terms, it's just a bigger version of the Gypsy Camp fight sequence from Rush with Love, but underwater. And of course, this sequence was reprised later. It turns up in Moonraker, but in outer space with laser guns. And you can make the argument, even the Spy Who Loved Me climax is pretty much a bigger version of Thunderball's climax, which dates back to From Russia with Love and the Gypsy Camp sequence. So Bond does need to have big battles like this from time to time, but it's interesting to note that the two major ones are in 2 of the 3 Terrence Young films, and really set that template of having the big action set piece, the battle, as it were. And again, like the Gypsy Camp, Bond is fighting with his brain and popping in and helping the military forces and cutting air hoses, and here he dumps Q's gadget-laden propeller tank and grabs a grenade out and then switches over to the rebreather. This way he's able to take out 3 Spectre frogmen and, of course, show his utter contempt for gadgets and break Q's heart yet again. So, it serves multiple purposes, but again, it's important to note that this is an expansion of Bond as intelligent fighter, and also the fact that this sequence is literally just to put it bluntly, a watery, bigger version of the Gypsy Camp sequence. And the flipper going up is a really cute touch. Again, sound effects play a key role in all the underwater sequences, and they're all foleyed up nice and loud so you could feel them, which adds to the impact, because otherwise it's guys moving very slowly. So you need that. You need that immediacy of all of the water effects. You need the boominess, the in-your-face quality to all the spear guns and all the knife stabs and all of the like that there, especially the glass breaking as the spear gun goes through the eye. And again, Barry's score cuts in and out, so it's this sort of back and forth that can make it feel longer, but it's definitely earned by the end of the film, because this is the climax. We do have the sort of tag ending after this on the speeding Disco Volante, but this is where the first bomb is recovered. This is what everything's built to, and the novel does the same thing. It builds to this sequence and is very, very gripping, and then we have the sort of postscript on the end. And this is spectacle like you just will not get anymore, because everything is done for real. That particular edit there, when we cut to the guy shooting the guy on the spear gunning the guy on the underwater sled, there's a particular hard cut in the music that really has always jumped out to me. And again, I think this is all showing that originally this was a lot more concise. So I wish the original Peter Hunt edit of the climax existed somewhere. It'd be amazing to see like a more energetic, shorter version of the climax. And I've always loved the shot of the spear through the arm. And now the sharks are starting to come in, and those are real sharks swimming through. So this is, I mean, none of this is faked. It's all real. It took countless hours. It took countless rehearsals. Both above ground and below under the waves. And now we have the great moments of blood. Largo coming around with the bloody knife, I think, is one of the great visuals of the entire series. And then the guys get freaked and actually have to shoot the spear at the shark. I mean, that's stuff like you would never get again. So, for everybody saying that this too slow for them, I mean, you cannot argue with the sheer visceral quality, the you are there quality of real guys struggling to the death under the waves. And then all of the survivors slowly give up. And now Bond chases the last stragglers in Largo over all of the sea floor of littered corpses everywhere. It's a very macabre touch if you look at it. And then the final battle, the Thunderball theme comes up, and Largo has the knife and waits for Bond. And then they have this little battle here. But because Largo's trying to get away, he just rips the mask off instead of having a final underwater duel. And, of course, there's no way to get the sled away because the minions have been captured. And now he makes the last ditch to get away because, as he says in a moment, we still have one bomb aboard. So now the primary goal, if you want to call it that, has been achieved. But there's still one bomb to recapture, and Bond must stop the lead villain. So this becomes the postscript, which later on would really become almost a tag ending. You get it somewhat in Goldfinger, you get it somewhat in From Russia with Love, but here it's even more, it runs even longer, and there's more personal stakes because, again, the Bond and Largo battle of wills has been so personally motivated and emotionally motivated throughout the film. So, in addition, Bond has to rescue Domino. Here's another one of the audio differences. Largo's line here is a little bit truncated in one of the mixes. So, and he'll say, we've got away from them. We've still got one bomb aboard, and it's a little truncated in the other mix. So that comes up and shortly after this point. So here's the nice old-fashioned naval chase of the Disco, which, of course, will slowly, very soon convert to its hydrofoil form, which is really, really marvelous when you look at it, and, of course, completely impractical. And they had a heck of a time getting it to work, as said in all of the production documentaries, because it's basically just two halves bolted together, and then they unbolted it and let the hydrofoil part take off. And almost in a sort of nod to the end of the speedboat chase in From Russia with Love, the attendants of the other section of the boat are left to totally defend, fail at defending themselves against warships. They're totally outgunned, but yet they keep firing anyway, which, it sort of endears them in your mind, because it's like they keep going and there's no way they can survive, but they keep shooting anyway. And this gives the time for the hydrofoil to get further away and build up speed and steam and add to the tension of the finale, because, there are chasing warships, but Bond is on his own going after the lead. And of course, if you look very closely there in the explosion, there is seemingly one guy who doesn't jump. Here's the line. So it is a little bit different in the other mixes. That's the other primary difference in dialogue between the alternative audio mixes. And Bond must make his very, very precarious climbing aboard of the hydrofoil at speed. It's interesting here that we have the character of Coots. We've only glimpsed before barely. He's converted his allegiances, but I would also presume that there was more stuff with him that was dropped from the second act. Now, this is the final fight aboard the Runaway Disco, and this was, of course, done on a set at Pinewood on rockers, so they could rock it back and forth and get the camera in there and really try and to add to the ferocity of the fight. Because, of course, at this point, they're having to also compete with the fight scene in From Russia with Love and others, and it's the last thing we see in the film, so it's got to have some bite to it. And Peter Hunt does speed up one or two shots, as he would typically, but if you look, most people like to point out the exterior footage, the projection is running way too fast, and that it sort of creates a herky-jerky motion that takes people out of it a little bit. I've never really had a problem with it, but it does... The slight unreality of it, the sheer visceral impact of the image moving past so fast, it does add to the sort of disconnect and the chaos of what's going on screen. And if you look very closely, it's some of the same coastline shots being repeated, but it is that chaos that is so important. And with the score building and building and building, it doesn't matter that, Bond punches the same guy more than once, or some of the same things happen over and over, or where there's some little continuity gaps. It's that hinges on this one particular moment when Largo finds the gun, Bond is dead, and then we get the reveal of Domino, who has just speared Largo in the back. And most crucially, Largo gets the time to take in who has killed him, and, of course, falls on the controls. Undercut with a nice little bit of humor. If you notice, Bond is bleeding at the lip. Again, Bond is human here. And, of course, the controls are jammed, but it just looks like it's Largo's body. So it's like, why doesn't he just pull Largo off? But there's no time anyway. And it's a fun little gag about Coots not being able to swim. Now, this was the explosion that John Steers used, basically an experimental rocket fuel. So it's this huge explosion. And it's unfortunate we don't get to see what he describes, because originally he describes it as the boat exploded and everything went up in the air and it practically collapsed on top of them. So this is the finale of the film with the absolutely iconic usage of the skyhook, which was, again, total future shock to most audiences in 1965, and is one of the most iconic Bond moments. This is one of the great endings of the series. Of course, like Dr. No and most of the Bond films, it takes place on water, and the yellow life raft would pop up again in You Only Live Twice. The actual shots of Sean and Claudine were shot on the Pinewood stage, which is why the water looks so clear, and it does look a little bit different. And I've always loved how Barry's music cue here has that little playful touch, and we get the nice shot of when arrows meet. The final difference in the audio tracks, one version ends with a instrumental of Thunderball, whereas the other goes into the original 1962 James Bond theme. Why this is, I don't exactly know, but both work. but to me, the Thunderball cue kind of fits more. But both fit perfectly with this absolutely iconic moment. The final shot of Bond and Domino being plucked away by the skyhook, and then immediately wipe into the end credits. Now, the end credits are a bit truncated because originally, apparently, the next film was credited as being On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and that was removed due to the switch to You Only Live Twice due to various production concerns. But it must have come so late at the game that it was just hard cut out and is apparently not in the film's negative either. So that's caused a big cut off in the film end credits ever since. So here, there's a hard cut, and it's really unfortunate because it truncates everything. So if you look here, it's a hard cut, and the film has been stuck that way ever since. So anyway, that is the conclusion of Thunderball, which is one of the absolute key Bond films. It went on to become the most financially successful Bond film to that point. Perhaps is the most widely seen Bond film, certainly on its original release, far surpassed even the globe-shattering success of Goldfinger, and in a lot of ways can be seen to be the film that firmly and forever cemented in the public's mind the idea of James Bond, what James Bond is, who James Bond is, the globe-trotting, the gadgets, the women, the larger-than-life aspects, the Ken Adams sets, everything, because it became the film that, you know, the most people saw and took the world by storm in Christmas 1965. And it's at this point where you could really argue it's the full peak of what became Bond mania, because after this point, you had even more rivals and competitors and spoofs. And so by the point of You Only Live Twice, 2 years later, they found themselves in the point of having to outdo themselves, outdo the competition. And also by that point, the sort of spy mania craze had peaked around the time of Thunderball and had started to fall off, which is why ultimately You Only Live Twice became less financially successful, because the sort of wave of popularity had crested with Thunderball. So Thunderball remains a great film. It remains one of the best films in the series, has the all-important contribution of Terrence Young. I do think you can analyze Thunderball to a very obsessive degree and still come away with a lot of questions, because there's still a lot of materials that we haven't seen. There's so much material that was taken out of the film, so many deleted scenes. But really, the pre-production, the whole history of the Thunderball story, and the attempts in the 1950s to get it started as its own film, long before Broccoli and Saltzman formed Eon to make the Bond films, is fascinating, and I think critical to understanding how Thunderball eventually turned out. So I think if you want to know more about Thunderball, if you want to understand its impact, you first have to understand the scenario of its release in 1965, the world it was released into, clamoring for James Bond after Goldfinger. But also you have to look into the whole history of the Thunderball saga. It's really a saga. You know, you have to look at the contributions of Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham and Richard Maybaum and John Hopkins, and then eventually Eon coming in and the whole development. And I think it's all of these disparate elements, and the fact that it was made as the fourth film after Bond becoming, you know, the great cinematic success of the 1960s. I think it's all these elements coming together in a melting pot, and all these different opinions and voices in the kitchen, as it were, that contributed to making Thunderball the film that it is. It's not a film that all Bond fans love. Some people do have a lot of problems with it, and some people adore it. It is still pretty divisive when people look at it critically, but still, it's one of the key films. And it is the point at which the Bond films fully became engaged as film spectacles. And some people can make the argument that that was a bad thing, and some people say it's a good thing. And I think the real key is finding the balance between great story and having the elements of the spectacular. So you have to find a way to make a Bond film a spectacular, larger-than-life experience, but not lose that all-important core key of reality that grounds all the events on screen and makes the audience participate along with James Bond and feel that inherent danger, that danger of every moment being potentially fatal is absolutely key. And it's a visceral part of the Bond formula that sort of comes and goes through the ages in the different films. So I think that is key to the Terence Young style that he injects into his 3 Bond films. And from this point onward, in every film in the series, I think there is a sort of dichotomy that happens where it's almost like a seesaw of sorts of going between the Terence Young style and more of the Guy Hamilton style. You could even further argue it's more the From Russia with Love versus the Goldfingers, and staying true to Fleming source material and going big and larger than life. But I do think the directorial styles of Young and Hamilton are so important, and I think most people focus on the films and the tones of the stories more, but I think the directorial styles are just as important. So I do think the 3 Young films are very key in establishing the Bond films, because he, as he would put it, he directed the first film, he directed what most people feel is the best film, the most serious, and he directed what is unquestionably the biggest film of the series, which is, of course, Thunderball. So that has been my commentary on Thunderball. I hope you found it informative and fun to listen to. Again, I do these tracks and I'm just going along with the film, and by the time I finish, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. There's so much material on Thunderball. If you haven't already, if you're wanting to find out more information, please do check out the fascinating making up documentaries on that originated on the fantastic Laserdisc box set from 1995. And of course, the 2 fantastic audio commentaries produced, the documentaries, and of course, there's great books out there. But most key would be the entire story of the Thunderball saga from the original conception date with Fleming and McClory in the 1950s is chronicled in the book Battle for Bond, written by Robert Sellers. It is an essential work. If you want to know anything about Thunderball, you need to get a copy of that book and read it from cover to cover. It is the first and only truly in-depth study of the entire Thunderball saga. And once you understand more about the back history, it really explains so much of what eventually happened on the Eon-produced Thunderball film. It explains so many things that it actually makes a lot of stuff make more sense than it originally did if you had just, like me, grown up watching the film over and over and over again. So with that being said, cannot recommend that book highly enough. Please do go check it out. And once again, thank you for listening to another commentary track of me babbling on about my life's obsession, which is the James Bond film series. Once again, many, many thanks. It means the world to me for people to listen to these tracks and hopefully get something out of it. And as always, I'm humbly yours, the motion picture analyst.